Hello and good morning. Welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede, and of course today I'll be speaking with Ellis Ross, the MLA for Skeena, who is going to be speaking to us about, well, what happened in Kamloops and what's been uncovered, as well as what his aspirations are when it comes to the BC leadership as BC begins to reopen. So please stay tuned for that. We're going to have him on around 9:30 till about 10:30. Until then, do remember to like and subscribe to us on Facebook as well as on YouTube to follow us there. And if you want to support independent journalism in the West and the free voice of the West, do take out a subscription at the Western Standard Online. We're going to get on to the opening statement here. If it looks a little janky today, I'm going to try and produce the show myself. So I'm taking the training wheels off. This is going to be a bit of an experiment. We're trying to do a sort of remote in thing. So every single little piece of it along the way, there might be some moments where things go a little sideways. Don't worry, the producer's waiting in the wings if necessary. But just so that you know, we're on the glider portion of the air traffic training, if you get my drift. First, let us turn to our BC provincial capital, which has decided that celebrating Canada Day is optional. I suppose that calendars produced around the legislature will now have the 1st of July designated as some kind of mystery day, the origin of which is unknown and the purpose of which is taboo to mention. Will the idiocy of Victoria's city councillors ever cease to amaze? I don't know. We'll find out. The capital city of British Columbia, named after our first monarch who reigned during the founding of Canada, has become a crime-ridden and drug-addled farce of overpriced housing, unintelligent policies, and, of course, woke rent-seekers who couldn't care less if their city burns. These leaders don't answer for their actions, they do not suffer the consequences of their own ideology, and they do not care about the people who live there, clearly. At one point, after winning the election but losing his seat in Ontario, that's to say Kingston, that was his traditional riding, a tradition that's been kept alive in British Columbia over the years, Sir John A. Macdonald actually represented the brand new District of Victoria. Some years ago, when his statue was removed, I mourned and I railed against the iconoclast, but I could never have predicted that they'd come for Canada Day next. There is a bizarre intersectionality going on with all this. The fact is that here at the Western Standard, there's an official policy of either complete secession from Canada for everybody west of Thunder Bay, maybe including Thunder Bay or Lakehead if you prefer, or the total rearrangement of the Canadian political experiment into a form unrecognizable today, with equal representation in the Senate and the strict enforcement of separated powers. So essentially a sort of I don't know if all sovereigntists are necessarily Republicans, with a small r I mean, but nonetheless, a very kind of Americanized system with equal effective Senate probably elected, as well as very, very strict separations between federal and provincial governments. Shouldn't we be in praise, therefore, of what's going on in Victoria? If you're a sovereigntist, this would be great news. They're canceling Canada Day. Isn't that good news? Well, deplatforming and delegitimize Canada is a rose of triumph by any other name for a sovereigntist, one could suspect. It will further the agenda of all sovereigntists to have, well, quite frankly, to have, there we go. It will further the agenda of all sovereigntists to make sure that we have that ability, right? That we have that ability. So, but the problem is, if you look at it that way, that we would join with the iconoclasts and try and quite frankly, move forward and build a sovereign Canada or separated Canada by joining hands with people who fundamentally disagree with the very idea of statehood, let alone legitimacy of government, that think that even the founding of Canada was legitimate. You're playing a dangerous game. And the dangerous game is that you're linking arms with people who would make their empire and make their kingdom on the ash heap of what's left of this country. And there's a piece of me that might allow that in a sense of like, well, I couldn't do anything about it and I'm retreating, and so I'm gonna let the iconoclasts have at her. But to join hands with them in burning down what I think is a fundamentally, at least moral idea of a country. I think Canada was founded on a fundamentally moral idea and a fundamentally intelligent set of policies of, well, if we don't want to be America and we do want to be a sovereign nation eventually under Britain, and perhaps even separated from Britain or whatever, with enough sovereignty to take care of our own affairs. This is doable, but what we've done so far has been very dangerous. And we have to be careful. If you are a sovereigntist, you're somebody who believes in sovereignty, you have to be very careful about what's going on when it comes to these things. We're going to look at a couple of different items here in the news and kind of go through them as we warm up for today. There's a few different things. So we have, apparently, Victoria Day cancels the celebration of, I'm just going to get rid of this guy. Thanks. Okay. Yep, there we go. And I'm going to go use my screen share. Share screen. I'm looking for Victoria Day. Window. Chrome tab. Share. Here we go. So, Victoria cancels Canada Day. Celebration in wake of Kamloops discovery. So, Victoria news. The city of Victoria has decided to cancel its Canada Day celebrations. Mayor Lisa Helps says the city is instead going to explore what it means to be Canadian in light of recent events, adding a broadcast will be aired later this summer guided by the local Lekwungen people. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I was not taught how to say that. This comes after the discovery of the remains of 215. We're going to say children because actually we would have to test the genetic material in order to know that all of them are indeed Aboriginal. And we have to remember that non-Aboriginal children went to residential schools as well, and they were also buried in the same graveyards as everyone else. Nobody has time to be so segregationist that they build different graveyards. That's a rich people problem. You can't, if you're going to be rich and racist, you can do that. If you're going to be poor and racist, you don't have time for that. So that's not arguing whether or not that happened. It's a simple statement of fact. People are all buried together. Usually they're separated by religion, if anything else, when it comes to Canada. And in Canada, that doesn't even happen all the time because there's some places where it's not practical to separate people by religion. So, citing Kamloops last month, Help says, as First Nations mourn and in light of the challenging moment we are having as a Canadian nation, the council is taking the time to explore new possibilities. It's interesting, actually, that, the guy we're having on in just a few minutes, MLA Ellis Ross, is a member of the Haisla First Nation, says he's disappointed adding Canada Day should stay. If we want to do something in relation to overall, in terms of Aboriginal experiences, maybe we can plan that, but it can be an inclusive event where all those people who want to understand more and learn about it, we can dedicate a day for that. Maybe it's Aboriginal Day. I don't know, he explained. My parents, both of them, went to residential school in Alberni. They went to Canada Day. They went to BC Day. It was a big part of our lives. My mother and dad made sure that we were there. We'd stake the place out on the side of the road for the parade. What's next? Is it BC Day? Because BC was just as complicit as Canada in terms of what happened to First Nations in the last 150 years. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that that Ellis is actually going to make the point of actually trying to stand up for, again, I understand, this is the sovereignty channel. Okay, this is the separatist channel. I mean, I'm not supposed to say the word separatist. I remember being told that by somebody in a staff meeting at some point. But the point is that whether you want to use that word or sovereignty, it doesn't matter. The point is that this is supposedly the Western standard that is all built around the idea of whether or not the West should remain in Canada. This is a valid question. This is an extremely valid question. It's something that should be debated. We try to debate it a lot on this show. We bring on people from the left, from the right, who all have different opinions about the question of Canada and how Canada should move forward. That's brilliant. But what's going to be great is, as I just said, our guest today has a real, I think, in-depth and nuanced opinion around this question. Terrible things did happen. There's no denying that. The federal government made some very arrogant choices when it came to the treatment of First Nations. It infantilized them in a lot of ways. It took away their choices, their ability to make choices for themselves, their families, and indeed their nations. This happened. This was wrong. The solution to that is not to somehow, one, erase the past, which is trying to teach us these lessons, that taking away anybody's choice doesn't work. Taking away people's ability to make decisions for their family and their community is a terrible idea. It's always a terrible idea. And erasing our past is only going to reinforce that. So we've got a couple of comments in the wings here. We'll go to those now. Pamela's making a good point here. Pamela's a big fan of the show. I'm really happy to have her here. It's always great to have consistent viewership. It doesn't surprise me that Lisa Helps would do this. She spent taxpayer dollars to remove the statue of Sir John A. It's true. That's true. I mean, they did pay to push John A. out of the public sphere. And that's a pretty serious decision. Like, could you imagine doing that? Like, you're paying money for that, for somebody who founded our country to be removed from the public square. That's some pretty serious stuff. And you got to think about that. And there's another comment here. But if Canada isn't Canada anymore, can you still leave it? Or just keep the parts of it in a new sovereign nation? We're a product of our past. Can't escape that. Catherine has a brilliant point there, too. You can't just erase the past. The past is part of us. And this is something, whether we're talking about it at a national level or a personal level, right? Like, I mean, basic psychology, right? People in denial of their own past, we don't consider that to be a healthy way of living. How can that be healthy as a nation? It can't be. It can't be. We're going to go through some of the other things that we've got up here. It turns out that we've got just this other column here, well, this other article that's coming to us from our premier. We're going to add this to the stream. Hey. No, that's not the one I wanted. Remove. I'm going to stop screen. I'm going to share. Sorry, you guys are running through me learning how to do this. This is me just learning this stuff, so please be patient. I appreciate your help. Somebody might argue that I should have known how to do this a long time ago. I'd say probably for the most part, but honestly, I was helpless without my producer. I still am, pretty much. He's definitely got some remote in device stuff here to make sure if I get totally lost, he can help me. BC Premier advises against cancelling Canada Day festivities. So, a day after Victoria canceled its Canada Day celebrations, BC Premier John Horgan says he doesn't want other cities to follow suit. The intent, I can understand, says Horgan. The 21st of June, National Indigenous Peoples Day, would be a more appropriate time for us to collectively focus on how we can redress the wrongs of the past and build a brighter future together. Victoria City Council voted unanimously this week to abandon virtual Canada Day festivities following the discovery of children's bodies on the site of a former residential school in Kamloops. Victoria Mayor Lisa Help says local Indigenous groups have since pulled out of participating in this year's Canada Day events. Okay, so let's notice something here. This is very interesting. So this came to us from CTV, and CTV decided to use the words discovery of children's bodies. I'll just highlight that there. I hope you can see that in the stream. But it's interesting that they chose to phrase it that way. And of course, the other editorial that we were just not editorial, it was actually a column. I'll just read it to you. I don't need to look it back up. 215 Indigenous children. Remains of 215 Indigenous children. So this is interesting because these are two reports about the exact same thing. And this is not opinion. This is news. These are both news. These are not opinion. This is by Rene Berhard over here on 1130, News 1130. And then this one was written by Travis Prasad. So both of them talking about the exact same instance in Kamloops. But it's interesting how quickly like that kind of change can happen, eh? It's just amazing, eh? I'm going to scroll past the swimsuits. Pardon me. But the thing is that it's interesting how reporting happens, isn't it? One of them is saying that they know with absolute certainty that every single remain of a child that was found there is indeed the genetic heritage of a First Nations person. And the other one is simply stating for the record that, yes, there are children. Yes, we have evidence of buried children, but we do not have final confirmation that every single child is indeed Aboriginal. This is important. This is important because we don't have that confirmation. And again, this is not about splitting hairs. Actually, it's something that needs to be brought up about even BC's northern capital. So I'm going to go on a bit of a rabbit trail here, but this does connect on the question of the bodies themselves. And for the matter, the cancellation of Canada Day or not. So here in Prince George, we have a place that's now called Clay Lake Tenay Memorial Park. But it was called Fort George for a long time, for the Fort George Park, because that was the site of the old fort. That's where the Hudson's Bay Trading Post was. That's it. It's that simple. It's right next to the Fraser River, about at most a mile from the confluence of the Nechako and the Fraser, two major rivers in this area. Obviously, the Fraser that goes all the way to Vancouver, but then the Nechako, a major tributary that comes out of the west towards Stewart Lake and what's now the Kenny Dams out towards Vanderhoof. The point is that this is where kind of the central hub of trade was in northern British Columbia after Fort St. James, right, which is on Stewart Lake, west of us. That was where the fort was. Now, lots of Aboriginals lived near the fort, both as the hired help and also as kind of the in-between, the people who either seasonally lived there or lived there full-time, in order to facilitate trade between, quite frankly, right, non-Indigenous, or the white man, if you want to call it that, or Europeans, or however you want to say it, and, of course, the Aboriginal population that was doing most of the hunting and trapping to get the fur trade going. So that's a fact, and we all know that. We've seen a fort like this in Saskatchewan, in Ontario, in Quebec. It doesn't matter. We've all seen, well, the fort isn't there anymore. I don't even think those are the original palisades. But the point is, like, we've all seen a site like this before. We know a nice flat piece of ground that was to defend the fort, right, to make sure you could have a clear line of sight if you did have to defend the fort from intruders or invaders or raiders. And, of course, lots of areas around it that would have been where people lived, either in their wigwams or in, well, I mean, out here they didn't have wigwams, but they did have the carrier built pits, actually, and they covered them with sticks and brush and stuff in order to keep them rainproof. But the point is that you have this area that you've seen 1,000 times in any other small town in Canada, because most small towns in Canada at one point were a colonial reality, right, when it comes to trade and the fur trade and that sort of thing. So we're all on the same page there. We all understand that. But there's also a graveyard. And so there's 2 points of contention when it comes to Fort George Park, and now called Lheidli-T'enneh Memorial Park. The first point of contention was always, quite frankly, if you want to use it that old way, right, the Indian burial ground. There is a burial ground there that is, as far as was kind of known or stated popularly in the popular consciousness, an almost entirely Aboriginal burial ground. And that needed to be kept more sacred because it wasn't given its prominence and that sort of thing. So people decided to change the name of the park. That's another point of the debate. And the other half of it was that supposedly the Lheidli-T'enneh, the carrier that were here, were forced out and unpaid and not given any compensation for leaving the area around what was then Fort George when the railway appropriated it in order to use it for its own kind of machinations for northern British Columbia, and moved out to Shelley, which is just north and east of town up the Fraser River. So further past the confluence is probably a couple miles. It's less than 5 miles past the confluence. So that's what Prince George deals with, okay? So there's 2 points. Who's buried in the park, and were the First Nations here forced out? The truth of the matter is that, as far as we can tell, not only did one of the local priests, a Roman Catholic priest, help the First Nations bargain for a better deal out of the Grand Trunk Railway and out of the CPR at the time. They did. They fought for that, and they helped organize the Aboriginals so they could agitate for a better deal when they were bought out for this piece of land. And the other thing that happened was an information request through a friend of ours here who is a historian, a certified historian, tried to get a hold of the information around who exactly was buried there. And the evidence suggested, again, if you want to be rich and racist, I mean, you can be, I guess, in the 19th century, but it costs a lot of money to be rich and racist. So if you were actually going to separate the bodies of people into separate graveyards, it costs a lot of money to have separate graveyards. Again, the only reason people were usually ever separated by graveyard site was, 1, can be pandemics, but most often, 2, by religion. Religion is really the only reason people were buried in different places. So, Protestants and Catholics, we saw that all the time with Irish Protestant Catholic tensions. You can still see evidence of this in Northern Ireland. We know that, right? Just as, what would happen with different faiths and how different faiths take care of their dead. That is the only thing that really separates people when it comes to their death. Other than that, you don't have the money to bury people in completely different plots of ground in order to keep up your facade of not caring about people based on their skin color. It makes no sense. So the point that I'm trying to draw here, I'm going to punt this from the stream. The point that I'm trying to draw here is that in Prince George alone, a lot of political correctness surrounds this issue because there are people who are buried and dead in our local city park, the big city park, the park that, funnily enough, is where Canada Day happens, and Aboriginal Day, and every other big day. I mean, if BC Day was actually celebrated around here. The point that I'm trying to draw here is that there are people buried there that undoubtedly there are people buried there because it was right next to the fort and white men were involved with the fort. Europeans were involved with the fort. When people died, they didn't go off into the great nethers and try and find a different place to bury them. They buried them nearby. So by that logic, both Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals are buried in the park. That's a statement of fact. We're just looking for the rest of the corroboration. It's a very likely trajectory. There's no holes in that theory. That makes sense. Nobody was going across the river to bury the Europeans somewhere else. They were burying them nearby. Simultaneously, the same story is also kind of sideways when it comes to this problem of was the First Nation here pushed off the land, and some people like to say that even their homes, the hovels that were around the fort were burned. And obviously that was a sign of racism. And again, this is a point of contention. A lot of people don't seem to understand that there was payment, there was an agreement, people were moved, they were assisted in moving, and then when it came to the actual former residences that were on what is now Clayton Park versus Fort George, formerly known as Fort George Park, the fact of the matter is that these were old abandoned places of living, which, as we all know, regardless of where you are in the world, whether you're in the first world or you're in the third or developing world, you know that if you leave a house long enough and you leave any kind of space long enough, no matter how well built it is or insulated, let alone if it's built in a very rudimentary way, it becomes a place where either disease or, of course, definitely vermin can live. And that's what happened. So that's the story. That's what happened here in Prince George. And that story's gotten completely twisted and completely disconnected to the point where it's become so politicized that if you try to do an FOI request around, I would like to know who's buried, whose remains have been identified. I would like you to know. I would like to do genetic testing to know who we've uncovered, because I did some digging in the park. They had to build a new palisade or something in the park. Not a palisade, but this new kind of thing for, I don't know, a band shell or something, and they disturbed some bodies. So of course they have to bring in the archaeologists. The archaeologists have to do their job. That's what happens. Well, where's the information? Who are these people? We need to identify them. We need to know. This is a previously unknown grave site. It's not a mass grave. It's just an unknown area of burial because nobody knows perfectly. If your headstone goes missing back from the 19th century, nobody knows where you're buried because nobody has a perfect plot of it unless you're in a very well-developed city. So all of these things are kind of all over the place. And you're not allowed to talk about them because it's not politically correct to do so. And we need to be very clear about this. If that's the reality that you're in, if you're in this reality where you're not even allowed to discuss something because it's so taboo, you're in deep, deep trouble. Deep trouble. Because what could possibly go wrong? How could it possibly go wrong? If you aren't allowed to discuss what's going on, you are in serious danger of not being able to tell the truth. And if you're not able to tell the truth and relay facts about what's happening around you, then you can't make proper decisions. And eventually your whole life is just going to descend into chaos in a mess of lies. And that's what's happening to our country. That's what's happening when it comes to these issues of Canada Day and what's happening in Victoria right now. Victoria is, you want to use President Trump's terminology, we'll bleep it out here because we're not going to use that. We're not going to use that language on the show, but it is a bleep hole city. And it's a bleep hole city because of what its city council has allowed to happen to it. It has no control over the poverty that's taken over. The drug pandemic has claimed more lives than the pandemic has, the viral pandemic. Lawlessness reigns in entire quarters of Victoria. There's been, I think there was a serial murder. I don't know if I'm going to call him an outright serial killer, but there was definitely some predator prowling about who's living amongst the homeless population and preying upon them and upon others. There's chop shops for bicycles that have developed inside of Beacon Hill Park. Hopefully we can get Aaron on here at some point. I just sent him a message, actually. I'm hoping that Aaron Gunn can come back on the program and we could talk to him about it because this is his stomping grounds. This city council has lost control of its city. You couldn't pay me to live in Victoria anyways. I remember the time that I dealt with Victoria. I was just passing through, parked my vehicle in a residential area because the apartment that I was visiting couldn't accept a full-size truck into its garages. So I parked it in a residential area on a Saturday night, was going to be back at my vehicle by the time church ended the next day. I already had a ticket. And that had been, somebody had called me in on a weekend. I want to know what kind of traffic Bobby is getting paid overtime to hand out tickets on a weekend for a truck that's been parked there for 15 minutes. Yeah, it was 15 hours, but it didn't matter. It was a weekend, and nothing was going to go wrong. The point that I'm trying to drive home here is that Victoria has lost complete control of its city, and the city council has the audacity to somehow blame the federal government, whatever mistreatment of First Nations aside, not saying that didn't happen, but somehow to distract from the fact that the Victoria City Council has completely lost control of its own town and can't put itself together and can't help the average citizen of Victoria. They're distracting from the issue. They're distracting from it by removing statues. They're distracting from it by canceling Canada Day. At what point do you look at your city council and go, well, what are you going to do about the poverty and the issues that my city faces, and how are you going to help with affordability and the crisis that we're having in Victoria? And then they start talking about racism again. That's not going to solve the issues that Victoria is facing today, and somebody needs to tell them that. We've got Ellis Ross waiting in the wings here. I'm just going to give Ellis a heads up here that as I bring him on, we're running today without a producer. So hopefully I get this right. There we are. Hey, look, I pulled that off. Hey, Ellis, you're back. It's great. But no, thanks for coming on. I mean, it's a bit of a glum time, I'm sure. The news out of Kamloops, in no uncertain terms, has definitely shocked all of us. I know that it shocked you personally very much. I follow you on social media. You were very clear about how this was affecting you. Maybe to help the rest of our viewership understand this a bit better, you can walk us through what went through your mind as this revelation came down, and what you think needs to be done moving forward.
Yeah, well, Nathan, 2004, because I had really no job description to do for my bank counsel who hired me on, I actually went and did some reading in the archives, and I read everything, including what had happened to my people and Aboriginals in Canada over the last 150 years. I also read some technical reports. I read everything I could get my hands on, but what got me was 2 weeks of reading up on the history of my people. That included the Indian Act, the reserve system, the exclusion, and residential schools. I actually ended up some years later putting together a pamphlet kind of describing at a very high level all the issues that I discovered over the years. But the residential school issue really struck me because when I was about 15, 14 years old, I found out that my parents went to residential school, both of them. And so when I read all those firsthand accounts and I read of all the documentation reports, it just killed me. It just took the breath out of me. And I just spent a few days in a very dark place. And I had really strong feelings of anger and revenge and vindictiveness. But after a few days, I realized, I can't come out like that. I can't come out with anger when like people are committing suicide, going to jail. Kids are going into government care because we're suffering from. I can't do that. Revenge is going to do nothing. It's going to be a fist-pounding, fist-shaking politician that doesn't have to do anything with these issues. So, it was a very dark time for me. And when I heard about the Kamloops discovery, that just took me back that day, sitting in the archives, on what I had found out on my own.
With regards to what we have in the archives and working through these questions, it has a lot of that inspired kind of some of your political understanding about how First Nations have to move forward. Again, you have a very unique take. It isn't the fist pumping, it isn't the political correctness sort of route that a lot of people, or the grievance culture, the grievance industry that's developed. You've tried to make very concrete policies in your time as chief counselor, and then as your time as an MLA, that would address Aboriginal issues on this. Is that where a lot of that came from?
Yeah, most of it. It was learning. Other people were telling me about the social issues and how other processes have failed to resolve those issues. But I was still struggling, looking for a way forward in a positive manner. And it wasn't until I started reading case law, Aboriginal rights and title case law, that I started to see the answer. And I thought Aboriginal rights and title was a way to get corporations and government to our table. And it worked. My band is now, we're not talking about poverty anymore. We're not talking about welfare, the Indian Act, We're talking about different issues, and we're building a community from the ground up. But the other parallel to that, I read what a judge said in terms of reconciliation, and it took me a while to kind of come to terms with what he said. But over the years, I figured out, yeah, he's actually right. The judge is right, because none of us are going anywhere. And like it or not, we have been reconciled for quite some time, probably since 2004. But you can't tell me that the two societies haven't really blended over the last 150 years, right from the day when the explorers came to our shores and First Nations wanted the beads and the steel that they had, and they wanted the technology. And so they started trading. And so it's been a process of both societies parallel going together in survival mode. Now, mind you, the politics of the residential school and the Indian Act, that kind of tore us apart. That redirected us. But reconciliation means to bring back together. And so the whole time that I've been trying to build up my region, build up my communities, I always kept in the back of my mind that say, hey guys, we can't make division lines around race. We can't do that. I mean, there's Caucasian people in my family. There's Caucasian people in my community. And so I couldn't, with a good conscience, turn around and say, well, all the rest of you are settlers and colonialists, and you guys should all go back to where you came from. I didn't think that was rational or reasonable, and ultimately didn't fulfill the definition of reconciliation as per case law.
This is exactly the point, though, when it comes to what Victoria has chosen to do. I mean, every MLA has two homes. They have their home riding where they reside, the people they represent, and then they have to go and live through Victoria. Now, Victoria can be a pretty place. It's a pretty temperate place. It's a little bit overpriced, in my opinion, but nonetheless, it can be a pretty place. But as it kind of struggles with all sorts of issues, drug use, high cost of housing, all sorts of problems, the city council decides in their infinite wisdom that canceling Canada Day, that'll fix everything. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. Is canceling Canada Day going to somehow undo all the terrible things that happened in Canada's past?
No. And it's something that I don't really subscribe to in terms of the guilt that Canadians are feeling today. I don't subscribe to it because the people that are feeling bad about it are standing with First Nations, and they want to do something. They want action. They're not sure what they want to do, but they want to support First Nations. Canada Day would have been the perfect time to celebrate that. The perfect time to come together. That's the whole definition of reconciliation. And when it comes to the guilt that Canadians feel for what happened just recently, that's 50 years ago, I understand your guilt, but it's not productive to start tearing down statues and start getting rid of holidays and getting rid of. I mean, Canada's a big place, and yeah, it's not perfect, but we're always continuously trying to do better. And then what? I don't really feel guilty for the atrocities that my band actually carried out on my neighboring bands when we go to raid them and then take their women and steal their food and maybe even kill a few people on the way. It's well known that that's what the culture was on the West Coast. I don't feel bad about that. That's not me. I wasn't around for that. Yeah, I'd like to make amends where I can. In fact, I tried to reconcile two other First Nations that had this same problem. But did I feel guilty about it, that I was a part of that? No. That was my ancestors. So I really think that we could do some really good positive things, not only to reconcile the residential school chapter, but the whole Indian Act suppression, the exclusion of First Nations. And then, for the last 15 years, or actually from 2004 to 2017, First Nations in BC were slowly getting included in the economy. I think that's a huge part of reconciliation, given the social issues that First Nations are suffering from. So, yeah, I've had better part of 15 years to think about this kind of.
One of the things that's an ongoing question is what that model might look like. So you have the completely politically correct, symbolic, doesn't change anything sort of movement of what happened with the city council in Victoria, and then you have the very innovative, concrete political change that happened with, say, the Nisga'a agreement, and that's a completely it's all but almost a sort of sovereign territory within Canada, within British Columbia. They have very strong rights around their economic future and their culture. I mean, obviously, one is completely symbolic. The other one's a very complicated way of doing things. It takes a lot of agreements and process. What do we need to move from the symbolic to what maybe the Nisga'a had, or is even what the Nisga'a are doing? It's kind of specific to them, and that's maybe most First Nations won't quite get that same sort of agreement out of the government.
No, Nisga'a did what was good for Nisga'a. And the 203 bands in BC, they're all completely different. And they're at different stages of where they think they should be heading. Some are saying no to treaty negotiations. They don't want that. They want economic development. Some are basically okay with where they're at. Some are taking advantage of opportunities. Some are trying to create economic development themselves in their own right, in their own communities. So it's really tough to say that what happened in Nisga'a can be applied to everybody else. But the interesting thing that I see out of this is right now there's confusion. There's a lot of sadness from Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals. And I've always had the opinion that you never make decisions when you're in an emotional state of distress. If you're angry, sad, confused, don't make decisions. Think about it, sleep on it, and come back to the table thinking clearly about not only what's happening today, but what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Mm-hmm. And what happened in Kamloops is pretty significant. I think it's a turning point. But at the same time, I think, the return, the repatriation of these remains to 203 bands in BC, even if it's symbolic, could do a lot towards healing. It could do a lot towards bringing First Nations and non-First Nations together. I mean, just think about it. 203 bands, each individual band on a day when they expect to receive remains coming from Kamloops or Coquitlam or Port Alberni or wherever these schools were, there's a day when there's remains coming into the community. Can you imagine the amount of Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals gathering, waiting to welcome? And it'd be something on a scale that nobody had ever seen before. And it would really, truly bring people together. Because I keep coming back to this. Non-Aboriginals want to help. They want to be beside First Nations. And they don't want to necessarily atone, but they want to be there to kind of help the healing and, be a part of the First Nations journey. And First Nations, the only thing I'm saying is that welcome it. Welcome it. It's exactly what we've been asking for the last, 50 years? We've been asking to be included. We've been asked to be taken seriously. We've been asked to go to the table. Well, now the tables are turned. Non-Aboriginals want to come to you. And then they just don't know how to do it. They don't know what to do. So the confusion is what you're starting to see in places like Victoria. They don't know what to do.
And indeed, they don't know what to do. They're grasping at straws. Again, politically, Victoria is a mess. And even if you couldn't blame any one person, or it's always many hands make for quick work of any place, if they're all helping themselves or they're not solving the real issues or facing the real issues. Nonetheless, that chaos reigns in Victoria, whether we're talking about Beacon Hill Park and any other aspect. So perhaps that's the thing. You have this symbolic gesture that makes it look like you've done something. I think it's interesting that you make the point that, of course, you shouldn't make decisions in anger and reactionary, and that you shouldn't, suddenly get on the phone and start calling 1-800, let's sue the government. Of course, I don't know if you're going to make a lot of friends in the legal community or in the grievance industrial complex. So you keep telling people to actually think through, not making unwarranted calls for I don't know, some new kind of grievance against the government.
Well, yeah, and I've been part of the First Nations government for a better part of 15 years. And, the one thing I noticed was all we were doing was spending money and wasting time on lawyers, on courts, on political fights. And yet, when I went back to my community, nothing had changed in terms of employment or the welfare list. or all the other social, nothing had changed. And so I took the definition of reconciliation to the political level and said, we got to understand what government is, and government's got to understand what we are and what we're trying to achieve. And once we got in that level playing field, things were easier. I mean, ultimately, I'll go for any cause and I'll look at the basics or the principles of what the cause is. But if that doesn't actually help people that truly need help, and I'm not just talking about Aboriginals here, as a politician or as a leader, if I can't see how a decision trickles down to the average person that's struggling, that needs a helping hand, then I'm not really interested. And I'm definitely not interested in something that tears society apart, that causes us to get on each side of a divided line. That's not the way to build a province. That's not the way to build a country, and that's not the way to build a society. I mean, I'm more of interest of saying, look, guys, yeah, we have our differences, we have our, different opinions, but that doesn't mean we have to take sides here and be oppositional. Because at the end of the day, I do appreciate living in Canada. I mean, just compare it to other places in the world where you have no freedoms, you don't have services, you don't have healthcare, you don't have, good infrastructure. Yeah, but I keep saying we're not perfect, but take a step back and see what we got. We got good social system in terms of social assistance. We got unemployment insurance. Places in the world, you get sick or you lose your job, you're done. There's no help coming. I mean, I just don't think that we should throw away the idea of Canada on this. I think we should actually set aside a different day and devote a whole day to what we're talking about in terms of reconciliation.
And it does look like there might be something coming down, at least at the federal level. Something in September might occur there. It seems like a national holiday might be on its way. But we can leave that for a moment. I mean, Aboriginal Day is just around the corner here. It's a week away. I guess Indigenous Peoples Day is what they're calling it now. That name's changed a few times, even in my lifetime, and I haven't been on Earth for very long. And as we kind of come to that and look at the situation in Kamloops and what's developed from there, what if you're going to obviously be asked to speak somewhere, either in your home riding or at an event somewhere, perhaps in Victoria, about this issue, or perhaps somewhere else in the province, about both the fact that Aboriginal Day is here and now we've of course got the issue out of Kamloops and this revelation we've had. What's the path of reconciliation you see there? What do you say to people as they look towards you and want to know how to feel about this moment as they feel those two things come together?
Well, I feel your empathy. I feel your sympathy. And of course, as an Aboriginal, I can't talk about residential schools. I've tried. Over the last 17 years, I've tried to talk. I couldn't do it. I even put together a booklet, The Meaning of Reconciliation, and a chapter on residential schools. I couldn't do it. I even tried to make a 2-minute statement in the legislature, and I barely got through it. I made a speech in Terrace, and I got the first 2 words out. Couldn't say the rest of it, so I had to get the moderator to kind of say my speech for me. If anything, I do understand the politicalness of this, and government's trying to make some type of signal, that they're in tune with what's happening. This is not going away. I mean, they're going to find more different. I mean, different bands are already asking for the same thing at different residential schools around BC, if not Canada. It's not going to go away. Mm-hmm. It's going to last a long time. And in terms of what I think is that we should, if you're looking to government, or if you're looking to politicians to provide a pathway to the healing, you're barking up the wrong tree. Politicians and government are not about human emotion or human nature. They're not about that. The politician, of course, will do it for votes, say what they can, do land acknowledgements, they'll talk about how much they learned from First Nations. And I'm more interested in the healing. Not only the healing between First Nations and non-First Nations, I'm really interested in the healing of First Nations themselves. And, people keep referring to this as the Kamloops. The Kamloops, or the Kamloops incident. It's not Kamloops. 203 bands in BC sent kids or got their kids taken away and sent to residential schools all around BC and Canada. This issue is actually directly linked to 203 bands in BC. Directly. I mean, my parents went to Coquitlam in Port Alberni. Thankfully, they came home and started a good, solid family. But I think this is a BC-wide issue, and I think that the conversation we're having has got to include every single one of those bands.
No, and it certainly does. And I mean, maybe that's kind of a way to pivot a little bit here to the question of leadership itself. We live in an extremely divisive time. Obviously, what came to light in Kamloops and the poor, quite frankly, these remains that need to be put to rest, and these children that need to be laid to rest properly, no question at all. And hopefully that happens, God willing, expediently and respectfully. But this same point is drawn everywhere, that inside of British Columbia right now there's an awful lot of division, and as widespread as the effect Kamloops would have had regarding, and the residential school there, regarding all the First Nations in British Columbia. Likewise, all the people in British Columbia are feeling very divided and in a way kind of leaderless under the current government. Let's talk a little bit about what that leadership would look like properly. We're starting to reopen British Columbia. Lumber is finally coming down from being the same price as gold for some reason, and as things reopen and the kind of economic devastation that happened over the last 15 months kind of comes to light, people are really wondering where they're going to be a couple months from now, let alone a year from now. What if you were premier? What would you try to do to help push BC back on track as we get loosened up again and get out of this lockdown mentality?
Well, in a previous life, I was chief and council of my community. And before I became chief, our community fell victim to division politics. There's always a faction of people within every First Nation community that wants to get elected, and they can't. So they find different routes. And so that's how external groups come in, and they find those factions, and then they kind of marginalize or ignore the elected leadership. Well, that happened to us. And just as a counselor, I overnight, I saw families break apart. I saw friendships break apart. The community, we're still healing today from what happened. But that was where I got my lesson on division politics. And I swore that I would never be a part of that. I would never really take sides in any of these issues, because I see what it does to people, especially in First Nations communities. We see what's happening in Fairy Creek right now. And the elected leaders are totally being disrespected, ignored, marginalized. I can only imagine what that community is going through right now, that band membership. And if you play this across the province, in terms of as a whole, as a province, there's division politics happening all over the place. In Aboriginal communities, non-Aboriginal communities, somebody's right and somebody's wrong. I don't play that card. Us as a first world country, division politics just seems to be so beneath us. It's just, you think about everything that BC and Canada has to offer the individual. Make no mistake about it, BC, no matter what kind of report you read, is a good place to live. 50,000 people annually are migrating into BC. And that's affecting a whole bunch of different factors that are affecting British Columbians. But people are coming for a reason. It's an attractive place to come. For everything I mentioned, because of the infrastructure, the freedom, the healthcare, you name it. There's a way to, but the division politics, I can't see myself using division politics, or even condoning it for that matter, because I see the damage it does, and it's hard to fix. And you get into that, whose ends are you serving? It's not your own. It's not benefiting you or your family or your kids. It's benefiting the politician. And I can't just sit back and watch BC, tear itself apart.
No, we certainly can't. and that's becoming more and more a reality no matter where we look. You mentioned Fairy Creek, of course, and we see the same thing with some of the opposition we've had to development in places. The homeless issue and the unhoused, that's been a huge issue, especially as the fentanyl crisis continues in British Columbia. We're kind of ground zero for the rest of Canada because a lot of it is imported through the ports in British Columbia. As we kind of try to reopen here and move forward, I think a lot of trust in government was definitely worn down by what happened throughout the lockdown. People were worried about their freedoms eroding, especially religious freedom. You know, Costco was open, the church was closed. It never really made a lot of sense. And I mean, when it comes to just in general, the sense that people have as we come out of this time, hopefully we feel that more secure in the future. But especially with the debt that's being carried by some people as well as by the federal government, let alone the provincial government. A lot of people are worried about that. When it comes to, say, just the debt especially, how do we need to rethink of the financing of our province and its projects? The debt has grown quite large. How do we make sure that we're not borrowing against future generations and we're leaving them a legacy, not a credit card statement that they'll have to pay off?
Well, we already are. I mean, that's the whole definition of deficit and debt. I mean, you got to borrow that money to pay off your deficits and continue the programming. And so there's no clear plan on, any government that has a 4-year term to pay off that debt. It's just too big. But at the very least, though, you could provide some kind of economic development plan to keep up with it. I mean, right now, the taxes have gone up in the last 4 years for businesses, for example. Well, businesses just pass that new cost on to consumers, which is us. So the cost of living goes up and on and on. And by the way, if government can't handle their debt or their deficit and then they print more money, well, inflation's on its way. And the only thing that I can propose that at some point in the future, our kids or our grandkids are going to have to cut programs and services because of the debt and deficits, or they're going to have to increase taxes. I mean, the only thing I can offer is like, man, we got to stop the bleeding and stop this, this tax increase, on and on. We can't do that. We can't keep taxing the people for what amounts to a government decision. But at the same time, we can balance that with a strong, booming economy in all sectors. But for that, you have to encourage investment to come back to BC. You have to, all of it, including pharmacare, I believe. I believe in value-added products, but these guys, they're just too scared to invest in BC. This is not a place to invest. There's too much bureaucracy. There's too much politics. There's too much red tape. I mean, that's basically what I think we should actually match up what's happening right now in terms of people worried about debt and their futures. You got to build up the economy to match what government's doing in terms of spending.
Mm-hmm. There definitely is a place too for I believe it was called the bully pulpit. That was what Teddy Roosevelt called it back at the beginning of the 20th century. Politicians using their authority to try and tell the people in charge elsewhere, especially lumber barons and that sort of thing, barons of industry, that they needed to do the right thing for the little guy and make sure they were investing in the little guy. It's not to throw anyone under the bus, but I mean, some of the mills remained closed throughout British Columbia, despite the fact that wood was worth more than it had ever been worth in the whole history of the world. It was an incredibly valuable product, and there was available fiber not far away, and yet those mills remained closed. Maybe the Fairy Creek question was better said. Well, there's this gigantic old growth tree that was hauled through the streets of the southern island as it was taken to a ship. But that's the thing; it shouldn't have been taken to a ship. It should have been milled on the island. How do we address that part of the issue? How do we keep those value-added realities here and make sure that those jobs stay in British Columbia? It seems like we're shipping a lot of them away, no matter what industry it's in.
Yeah, and it's manufacturing as well. That's the bell calling me to the house. It's manufacturing as well. And the thing about it, when we're talking about value added, whether it be forestry, mining, LNG, we're talking about value added. There are investors out there that want to build stuff in BC,
Mm-hmm.
and they say, we don't like you selling your export over to Asia either in its raw form. But man, can we get some help over here in terms of building our plant here to actually build high grade plastics for the aeronautical industry? Yeah, that I'm throwing my support behind that. There's the OSB plants.
Mm-hmm.
Can we take some of that waste wood that's in the forest, instead of putting it into burn piles, can we put it into an OSB plant in terrace, mind you, and then ship that product over? I mean, there's a number of people offering up these value opportunities, but we don't have an environment that's conducive to investment. If they see that they're not wanted, there's too much work or too much red tape, too much taxes, they go to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Simple. I mean, they're even doing with Canadian LNG. We couldn't get LNG exported. So now our LNG, there's a proposal to ship LNG to the United States so the United States could ship LNG to Asia. This is absolutely ludicrous. I mean, we're okay with sending our oil to the United States so they can export, okay with sending our gas to USA so they can export it, but no, we shouldn't export it ourselves. I don't see the difference. And this is all based on politics and mantras and division. But mind you, I don't see the same kind of attitudes towards the United States doing this. I think we really got to look inwards and do what's best for us. I better get to the house.
I
I gotta make
understand.
it to the house.
No, I understand. Thank you so much for joining us while you could, Ellis, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Nathan.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, that was a little briefer than I had hoped for, but that's not a problem. We'll continue on with some of the other news that's coming out of the rest of the day here. Again, we're talking about a few different things. One of the biggest things being recently that a Canada Day is going to be canceled when it comes to Victoria. I'm sorry that we didn't get to your question there, Rose West, around where Ellis lands on sovereignty. I don't mean to speak for Mr. Ross, but as far as I know, Mr. Ross is a Federalist. And as I've told you all before, we're gonna start on this point again as we kind of turn the hour here. I remain ambivalent about the question of sovereignty, and I'm gonna say actually this is probably a perfect place to explain why. Right now, in Victoria, there is a bunch of people being paid very good salaries to basically dump on the decisions of past people who were paid pretty good salaries, and some of whom weren't, let's be clear. A lot of those residential schools were being run by people who were being fed bread and water and the hope of heaven as their reward. They are dumping on people from the past, our current leadership, and getting paid for it. They're getting paid to dump on those past decisions and not make decisions in the present that are helping anybody. It doesn't help anybody to cancel Canada Day. It might help to start figuring out the homeless situation, the unhoused situation in Beacon Hill Park in Victoria. Same thing in downtown Prince George. People can hem and haw and go on and on all they want about the questions of Canada Day and the evils or mistakes that Canada made. That's not up for debate. There were mistakes made. There were decisions made by omission and by commission, by will and by ignorance that ended up literally killing people at times. Not in the droves that some people think it happened, and not in an actually willfully genocidal way. Again, I don't agree with that interpretation of history. But nonetheless, people made decisions and things went wrong and people died. That's true. That did happen. But at the same time, that does nothing to fix the issues of today. And waxing philosophical about it or canceling Canada Day is not going to fix that. And people need to be honest about that. We all know that. But nobody's allowing that to be spoken out loud. So that's where I jump off as being quite upset with all of that. We're going to jump to, we'll use the Times Colonist. I haven't used them in a little while. And apparently the Daily Hive has something, but we'll use the Times Colonist for now. We'll use the share screen. I'm also just kind of learning how to do all this stuff. So, as I've said before, hopefully you guys can be patient with me today. So here we go. The Times Colonist. I'm pretty sure they're related to the paper I used to work for here in I wrote for in Prince George. Victoria cancels Canada Day. Broadcasts as First Nations mourn residential school deaths. Victoria is cancelling its Canada Day broadcast and instead planning to work with the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations to create an alternative event at a later date amid nationwide calls to cancel July 1 celebrations. And again, that voted unanimously. That really bugs me. Voted unanimously. Not even one person had the guts to say no. Not even one person had the guts to say, hey, why not be honest about what happened here? Because what's happening with our survivors right now is the years of suppressing all those memories. It's like the wounds you have opened back up. I get it. There's some problems here. There's some deep issues here, and there's some things that have gone very wrong. But we need to be honest about the fact, very honest about the fact, that, quite frankly, one, just as there were good stories that came out of that time for people of Aboriginal descent, there are positive memories too. And there are abusive memories for people of non-Aboriginal descent who were sent to those schools because it was the only school available. It's not always so easy as the narrative suggests. There's other things with the narrative, and we ought to be honest about that. If we don't allow ourselves to be honest about it, we're in deep trouble, and we're going to end up in trouble very quickly because we're not being honest about what's happening. There's actually something else I'd like to bring up. Let's talk a little bit about homelessness, which is directly related, because a lot of people say, well, it's said in many areas that basically what happened with residential schools directly impacted First Nations to the point where a lot of the family trauma happened and a lot of abuse happened inside of their families because of what had occurred at residential school. And therefore, that's what's led to so much substance abuse and homelessness and intransigence amongst the Aboriginal population. This is the general theory. But regardless of how well that holds up, let's talk a little bit about the issue of poverty in Canada. So I'm going to quickly flip over here to another column. I keep saying column when I mean report, but council approves, sorry, I'm looking at this on my phone, Safe Streets Bylaw. PG Citizen. So this is my old stomping grounds. This is where I was before. I'm going to put that into a different tab. I'm going to bring it up this way. Share screen. And council approves to share. Okay. So this is my old stomping grounds, the Prince George Citizen, and I wrote for them for several years as a columnist, and we're going to just take a little bit of a look here because this directly relates to this whole question of Aboriginal issues in our day and age, because precisely, and not unlike what's going on in Victoria, this is interesting because this is their solution to the problem. So instead of talking about Canada Day and cancelling that, what they're talking about is whether or not they're going to do something about homelessness in downtown by creating supposedly a bylaw around it. So City Council voted in favor of a controversial proposed bylaw that would impose fines for nuisance behavior like panhandling, open drug use, and camping in public areas. While protesters advocating for the rights of the homeless camped on the lawn of City Hall, a sometimes emotional debate about the Safe Streets bylaw was going on inside City Council chambers on Monday night. In a divided vote, so that's interesting, at least it was a divided vote, regardless of where you land on that issue, it wasn't like Victoria Council, where apparently you might as well have one person voting, not 10. In a divided vote, City Council approved the first 3 readings of the Safe Streets bylaw. A final reading of the bylaw is expected to come before City Council on June 28th. Under the proposed Safe Streets bylaw, bylawers could issue $100 tickets with a $75 penalty for late payment for a variety of nuisance behavior. Under the bylaw, it would be prohibited to panhandle within 10 meters of a bank or ATM, bus stop, daycare center, liquor store, cannabis store, restaurant, coffee shop, or convenience store. The bylaw would also prohibit panhandling people in vehicles when they are parked, stopped at a traffic light or stoplight, filling up a gas station, or any other way that obstructs traffic. After sunset daily, which of course doesn't make a difference right now. We're right before solstice. It'll still be like 8 o'clock with the sun out throughout summer. They get together for prohibited drugs. Disposing of paranoia on the street would also prohibit open burning on any street or open park, and of course voted to reject a proposed amendment to the Parks and Open Space to allow homeless people to temporarily camp in designated areas when shelters in the city are full. So this is going to be updated soon. Okay, let's get into this for a second. Let's go to this question just briefly here. So we have this issue, and it's a growing issue in Canada of homelessness. And if you want to use kind of the other talking point, they say the unhoused. It's the unhoused. I think that we have to start from the beginning here, which is to say that poverty, while the de facto reality of a person, say at the beginning of civilized life, people are, let's put it this way. Poverty isn't a mystery, prosperity is, in a sense. That's how we need to start, as a purely economic idea. You can go down the road anywhere and see, especially in Canada, and see wilderness. And that wilderness may or may not sustain you if you know how to survive in it. But 9 times out of 10, if you didn't know what you were doing and you were stuck in the wilderness in Canada, you would not survive. And so, even in the summer. And so the problem becomes very quickly that poverty is actually our kind of natural state. It takes a lot of work to get to survival, and it takes a lot of work to get to maybe even thriving or doing all right, and then finally into prosperity, which is excess wealth. Right? That's the economic argument. The economic argument that poverty is like gravity. It's actually the natural inclination of all economic activity, because you can always spend more than you have. It's always easier to spend than to save, and quite frankly, it's harder to get ahead, and it gets harder and harder to get ahead, especially without proper education and that sort of thing in the times we live in. So that's kind of the typical mainstream argument when it comes to questions of poverty. But for me, I feel like what I've observed in my own lifetime is that on the question of poverty, especially in Canada, you'd think that Canada would be a great place that could kind of fix this for itself. I mean, even Mr. Ross was just on a moment ago telling us about, we have EI and we have universal health care and all this stuff. Like, these are great things. And he's kind of got a populist position on that, this kind of, for the people sort of position of, we have these entitlements, and these entitlements are good, and these entitlements help us, and government services help us stay a healthy, happy population that doesn't feel like it's getting the raw end of the stick all the time. It feels like it's getting a fair deal from its rulers and from its betters, and the general population is pretty well taken care of. I feel that what's gone wrong kind of in Canada and in the West generally is that the idea of just steady work at all is somewhat disappearing. I subscribe to kind of using the language of, it is some kind of left-wing language, but one of the left-wing words that's really kind of come into my mind that I use a lot nowadays, and I think it's actually getting pretty widespread, is the word precariat. Precariat. I kind of wish there was a way for me to kind of type things and put them on the screen. Actually, we're gonna turn this into a teaching session. We're going to go off onto the internet, and we're going to type in the word precariat, and we are going to get a definition of the word precariat, and we're going to share screen that, and that way we can all be on the same page as to what is precariat. What is that? Let's go find out. Okay, so define precariat. Here we go. People whose employment and income are insecure, especially when considered as a class. Okay, the precariat. Most of them in the precariat are just trying to create a meaningful life for themselves. Okay, that's a terrible sub-definition, but that over-definition is very accurate. So again, people whose employment and income are insecure, especially when they are considered as a class. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up, the word precariat, is that it really rings true for me, because I was raised in a very well understood, I guess is what I'm saying. In the popular imagination, not something that's hard to imagine. I was raised in the upper middle class. My father's a physician. My mother stayed home with the kids while we were still all kids. And then when we became teenagers, she went back to school, went on to get her counseling MA, which is actually an MA in Ed when it comes to the university here in Prince George. But the point is that, and now she makes, a pretty decent wage doing what she does as a counselor. So father's a physician, and now she makes, a pretty decent, and then as she does. So upper middle class physician, we know that. So I am a set of privilege, and that's the way it is. Upper middle class physician, we know that. So I am a set of privilege, and that's the way it is. But in my own lifetime, particularly because I chose to basically exit my class, I chose not to stay in the university system for 10 years studying who knows what, something nonsensical or practical, it doesn't matter. The point is that, after enough schooling, anybody will start paying you when it comes to the way things work in Canada generally, but definitely in the West. Instead of doing that, I tried to get out of my university. I graduated, and I tried to just get out there and work. I took a trade. I took a welding when I graduated, and I became a C-level welder. I was fully certified in all positions of welding, for stick welding and wire, and then oil crashed. So right at the moment that I was, as a burgeoning young tradesperson, nobody wanted to hire. Even my own indentured masters, the people who were to see my apprenticeship, they kind of kept telling me to chase my own work. As A-level welders were competing for $20 an hour jobs, which is actually beneath what I should have been paid. So, and far beneath what they should be paid. On and on and on it went. Right. So for those of you who are in Alberta, the oil crash affected me directly. I'm very aware of what the oil crash was because I was there. I was there at ground zero, trying to start my life and having it, upset yet again. Again, I'm a child of 2008 and the mortgage crisis in the United States, and of course the Euro crisis in Europe that they still haven't recovered from in Europe, which is the direct reason that Brexit happened 8 years later in 2016. I'm a child now of COVID as well. An adult of COVID. I turned 30 the year COVID happened, and it looked like things were finally lining up for me. I finally had an adult job. I had a place I rented on my own. I wasn't living with mom and dad. I had a vehicle, and then I purchased a vehicle, and financed it a few minutes before Trump signed the travel ban from China. And of course, I had a decent job. I was a sales guy. I sold Ricoh, which are photocopiers. So that was the height of my economic life, and it took me out of looking at my adult life and compared to people just a generation ahead of me. It took me, if you want to count from the end of university, it took me almost twice as long as it took other people with the same amount of education as I had a generation before to get into an economic position where I could reasonably say I am an adult, a self-supporting adult who was now ready to explore the possibility of being with somebody from my faith community and starting a family with her, right, and getting married, starting a family. That took, again, probably 2 to 3 times as long as it took the generation before me. And 2 generations ago, into the grandparents' generation or into elder boomer generation, people, again, were 10 years my junior by the time they were already well into at least beginning something that would be a career that they would stay in for probably no less than 10, maybe 20, maybe their whole lives. So 10, 20 years of their whole lives. And already getting on into buying a home and having children, having families. That's the reality of that. So that used to be a reality that you could achieve somewhere between 18 and 23. Then it became a reality that had to be achieved between 23 and 28. And now I'm in the 28 to 33/35 category, right? Or 34, 18 to 34, I think is kind of the limits they put on that for demographics. The fact of the matter is, and here's Rowan telling us some things on his end. Yep. No, I feel you, Rowan. Here we are at the end of these things. So I'm into my 30s, and I'm about to get married. I'm very thankful for that. And luckily for us, it's not that I'm planning on being a bum inside of a relationship, but luckily we understand that marriage is a vocation through and through, at least in our faith, and that's the primary way of looking at it. Everything else is gravy. Everything else is, well, you just make the vocation work. You serve the vocation, not the other way around. You don't just postpone marriage forever because you can't quote unquote afford it. It has to be something that you pursue, and then hopefully God provides, and you work hard. And you have to also be satisfied maybe with your lot in life a little bit. And that's a very humbling experience for me. But the point is that kind of coming back to what I'm trying to talk about here when it comes to homelessness and everything else is that, as far as I can tell, things are more impoverished now than they were in my parents' or my grandparents' generation. The great upswing of the post-war era is all but over or crashing, and it's just kind of, if you can get to a slightly less sunken ship in our economic situation, you'll do better. So you're at the top of the Titanic and you're looking down, you're like, hey, well, I mean, those people are the ones drowning, I'm fine up here. Well, the boat's eventually going to sink, and of course the crocodile might eat you last, but it's still going to eat you. And so the point that I guess I'm driving home here is back to the question of poverty and homelessness. Something tells me that we're looking at this wrong. I'm not saying that people who are impoverished or are living unhoused and or are transient populations do not have to take responsibility for their own life whatsoever. That's not the argument. I don't think that people are pure victims, that they have no agency, that they have no free will and free choice. That's not the argument that's being made here. At the same time, I'm telling you, as somebody who, quote unquote, had every advantage in life, I'm struggling. I'm struggling. And if that's how I'm doing, and I was lucky to have parents that loved me, and I was lucky to not have alcoholic, guardians. I was lucky to be raised the way I was. I was lucky to have a faith that inspired me to work hard. All those pieces of that equation. If that's how I was raised, and how lucky I am to be who I am, and to be where I'm at, and I still have a lot of ground to make up and a lot of catching up to do. How much more so for people who didn't have those things? That's where I think the empathy and the sympathy has to start. If even people who ought to be, quote unquote, they ought to be fine. They ought to be fine, right? They ought to be fine. If even that group of people aren't doing well, how much more so for the people who, quote unquote, don't do well either, period, or are just on a different place in the bell curve, right? Which means that they're just more susceptible to things going wrong. So I think that's the part where we have to start addressing things. It's like, okay, so we understand that things are more impoverished for everyone generally, unless you want to become a part of the rent-seeking class, or the managerial class, or the professional managerial class. And I kind of consider it all rent-seeking. That was another aspect. I'm going to take a little sidebar here and come back around. So I really wanted to work in a real job. I wanted to be a part of primary wealth creation in this country. I thought it was really wrong that we had entire classes of people that did not contribute to the wealth. They only took from it. And these weren't, it's funny, that argument's always made about welfare and the least of these, and, all these people having 10 kids who don't have jobs. It's like, well, let's be honest here. There's entire classes of people in Canada, because of our bureaucracy, the size of our civil service, and of course the fact that medicine is socialized and education is socialized in Canada, that there are huge realms of people that, yes, they might offer a valuable service, but they're still being paid by people who actually break their back for a living, right? People who actually have to drive for 30 hours and have to do a loader and have to dig up something valuable and then turn it into something more valuable and then sell it, by people in retail, in business, in small business. Taxpayers is essentially what we're saying. First line taxpayers. I don't actually, to be honest with you, I don't even know why we take taxes off of people who are paid by the government. It just seems like they should just be paid their net amount. I don't understand. Why does the government bother recycling money to itself? I've never understood this. If someone could explain that in the comments, please do. I don't understand why we bother dealing with this when it comes to the government. And I just think that people who work for the government, regardless if you're a soldier or you're a postal worker, you should just have your net income sent to you. I don't know why you have your gross income even written on your EI or on your statement or your T4. It makes no sense. Like, you're a ward of the state. Your net income is all that matters. You already work for the government. They're just sending you the money and sending it back. It doesn't make any sense. But I guess to the point that I'm trying to draw here is that we have large swaths of this population that depend on the government as employer, not just as entitlement giver, but employer. And let's be clear, being an employee of the government is a good gig, especially at the lower levels compared to lower level employment elsewhere. You make a lot more money working for the government pushing a broom than you do pushing a broom anywhere else in this country. And so the issue is that if that's reality, if we have entire swaths of people that are employed by the government or directly related to the government, as medicine is, right, as either doctors as contractors or nurses, of course, as employees of the health authorities, and then finally in education, right, of all levels, right, if that's the reality, then I always wanted to be a part of, not necessarily supporting that reality. I didn't want to support it necessarily, but I wanted to help be a part of primary wealth generation. And that's why I got out of school after I graduated, and I wanted to try to become a welder. And then that fell through, and it fell through for years. And I tried this and I tried that. I got into this industry and that industry. There are a few different things I pursued. I always wanted to stay away from government work. And I always wanted to help lead the charge when it came to, hey, you know what, this country is worth saving. Again, I'm ambivalent about sovereignty, right? But at least this province is worth saving. At least this region is worth saving. And we need to do the things necessary to do that, which would require primary wealth generation. But I've lived as a member of the precariat. Again, I just had that defined for you, had that up there, my whole adult life. And it's really shaped a lot of the way I view the world, because I've just never been secure in it, ever. Economically speaking, I've never had economic security in my entire life. And that is something that I really think we need to think about that for a second. Like, I might look like I'm not even trying to brag here or be egotistical, whatever, but I just mean, like, you look at me on the screen here and you think to yourself, well, I mean, like, that just looks like, I mean, like, he kind of looks put together. I mean, his face is clean. He's got a shirt on that kind of fits. I mean, it's actually kind of loose on me. I lost some weight, but the point is, like, he looks kind of put together. He's in front of a green screen. He's got a camera. He's got a microphone. Like, he looks like he's kind of got stuff together. It's like, no, actually, like, I might have a number behind my name that tells you how old I am. I'm 31. And supposedly that would be enough, right? Like, I'm an adult, right? Well, no. No. I don't have the adulthood that was accessible 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50, 60 years ago. That adulthood has never been part of my reality. And of my friends, there are some people who are doing pretty okay. Most of them are in protected classes. I went through this the other day. I thought about it. My beloved works for the government. I got a buddy who works for one of the big five financial institutions, one of the big five banks. I got another buddy who works for Northern Health. I got a buddy who's an engineer, which, I mean, that's a third party. It's a private industry, but still, I mean, engineers, they get called. They don't have to call the government. Government can call them. And other big contractors to get a hold of them. They don't have to chase the work the same way. I'm not saying they don't work hard. I don't think they really have to chase it too much. What else have we got in our friend group? We got an RCMP guy. As I look through our friend group, there's just a lot. Then there's a couple of teachers, especially amongst the females. There was one nurse. She's not. Both of the nurses have moved off to other places, probably for better pay. But yes, we had nurses. But, like, is there anybody who's actually in a private job, like, even if it's not a primary industry, so they don't necessarily go harvest trees. The buddy that I'm about to mention actually does both those things, both a primary and a tertiary or a semi-secondary industry. Everybody works for either a large institution like the big five banks or something else like that, a big legacy institution, or in an industry that's a big legacy stuff like engineering, right? Like, I mean, again, you don't chase work chases you. Or they work for the government, or in some capacity for the government in another category, right? So direct civil service, or as education and or as healthcare. There's one guy out of our whole friend group who I can think of. There's a bunch of guys who who work kind of, no offense, crappy jobs that are really low paying, low skilled jobs, to trying to get themselves by. Some of them are students, some of them aren't students anymore. So they're just, so now they're in that danger zone I've been in many times in my life too, where like, well, I mean, how can I be a real man? I don't work a good job. I don't have a good job. I want to work a good job. I want to be paid more. I'll work as hard as I have to, but I'm not in a good industry. I'm not in a job that's going to pay me well or support a family. And how do I get out of here? I don't know if I can afford more school, or even if I could afford more school, that's time away, and I got to deal with that. And it's a real predicament. You know, you're getting towards 30. I am 30. I'm past 30, and you're still not sure what's happening, and you're still really confused about which way you're supposed to go here. Your parents told you that, they didn't say even everything would be fine, but they told you, oh, by this age or by that age. Your grandparents, oh, I remember when I was this age and I already owned a house. You're in your 30s, and you're like, that's interesting. Rowan had a good point here. Of course, because the bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the ever-expanding bureaucracy. A great quote, of course. And Pamela had a good one here, too. Plus, government employees get great extended benefits that many other banks who pay their salaries don't get. That's also true. That's another big deal. So there's quite the big discrepancy between those who work for the state or any kind of state authority, municipal authority, government authority, and those who don't, and to those who live in big institutions anyway. So you got a big great employer. You're with the big five. You're with a legacy history. You're with a bank, period. And again, or your mortgage broker. Like, you're doing these things, and you're part of, again, the professional managerial class. And the average taxpayer, the average person, whether they're a fry cook, or they are even a trucker, or they are even a medium small business guy, like, they might make okay take home if they're even a part of that upper echelon of non-government employees of any kind, non-government, non-third party, private sector employees or employers, but they just don't have the security that somebody who works for the government does. And so going back to this friend group thing, as I survey my friend group, there is literally only one guy I can think of who's doing well at it, but that's because he's a part owner with his brothers in a roofing business. In the winter he logs, in the summer he roofs. And you sit there and you think about that, and that's pretty significant. That's a pretty significant discrepancy for the reality of what I invite you to say it in the comments. If you're older than me, anywhere from 8 to 10 to 20, 30 years older than me, tell me in the comments how many, if you looked around your friend group back then, if you looked around your 10 friends, how many out of 10 of your friends worked for the government, or worked in a big legacy institution, or worked in a direct third-party provider of always guaranteed employment when it comes to either government contracts or large contracts. Maybe the simplest way to say it is people who didn't have to chase their work. Out of those 10 people, or were in some kind of private industry where they were an employee and they had security as an employee, you know, and as a low-skilled one, or as an educated one in a bare minimal sort of way. They didn't have an engineering degree. They didn't have a professional designation. They just went and did their 4 years at college, or they did an associate's, and they were making a family-supporting wage. That is slipping away from us as a country. And you need to think about that. We all need to think about that. I would never have thought about this. I'm not afraid to say that I'm a son of privilege. I'm not afraid to talk about my privileged background, because I don't live there anymore. I'm not a part of that anymore. And I'm not a part of that anymore because it's not like I don't love my parents or something, or I never see them. It's just, I mean, I'm no longer a part of that class of people anymore, in an uncaring sense of people who are just kind of, you know, blindly in their happiness, and they just don't think about anyone else. I just mean, I guess, that I've developed empathy. I have just been on the wrong side of that for so long. I have very little sympathy for the class of people that I was raised in. And I was lucky to have parents who furnished me with a really strong character, because, I mean, they did have some real big suffering, especially at the beginning of their life. My father had cancer their first year of marriage, him and my mother. And so they're real people. They have real stories. They have real things going on in their lives. And I think that's just kind of maybe a place to start of just kind of, when we come back to this question of poverty, It was said well on Twitter during some of the riots that were happening throughout 2020 and in the United States. I obviously I had no time for a lot of the racial discussion that was going on because I thought that was all gaslighting and it wasn't real. Whatever happened with Mr. Floyd and whatever else happened down there, the point is that people used that whole instance to their advantage, and that's an evil, wicked, craven thing to do, and everybody needs to be honest about that. Need to be completely honest. But let's leave that aside for a second. I think that when we come down to the poverty question, there was this one tweet that came out during some of those riots, and it was like to remind people of which side of the line they should be on or who they're actually in solidarity with, like who is their class or where is their belonging. Remind people that everybody's 3 months away from losing their house, not 3 months from being a billionaire. And I think that's about it. It's not that the issues of the underclass are the only issues. That can't be true. And we got to be careful about everything from Les Mis to I'm trying to remember what Dostoevsky wrote. I don't even remember what it was called. But someone remind me in the comments. But the point is that we have to be careful about that because we don't want to romanticize the underclass in the sense that there's no culpability around the question of if you made decisions that led to economic problems, you have nothing to answer for it. That's just not true. That's not true. $10 today I spend on a meal at McDonald's is $10 tomorrow I don't get to spend on wedding decorations, right? Like that's a reality. That's fine. We need to understand there's consequences to decisions. That needs to be preached all day, and we can't take away agency from people. But the subtle racism, the subtle classism and other things of low expectations, that's wrong. But simultaneously, on the poverty question, even in Prince George, my hometown, my better half with a government job and a decent down payment can't afford a house that was built in 1960 and probably has some problems and needs a lot of work. She can't afford it. When even a government employee making a decent wage can't afford basic housing, she's not trying to become an empress of landlords. She's not trying to become some sort of slumlord, right? Like she and I aren't going and touring, apartment blocks to get 10 houses going at once so that we can become the slumlords of Prince George. We're looking for a home for our future family, and we can't afford it for something that was built 50, 60 years ago and needs work, needs help. And even those things are the only things in our price range, and they get bought out from you. There are people that are outbidding others, especially from Vancouver and elsewhere, and God knows, probably some of them are from China. We're going to get into that topic next week of how money is being laundered through Canada and that sort of thing. There are people being outbid here for, again, things that are not. They're BC bungalows. They're split levels. They were built 50, 60 years ago. I don't even care they're built 40 years ago. The point is that some of them were well built, but they still need work. They need to be renovated. They're coming to the end of their initial lifespan. They're getting their halfway lifespan. They need new insulation. They need renovation. They're outbidding people by, I've heard numbers like $50,000, $80,000. I've heard people of walking into something that was already overvalued at $420,000 for a house that is not worth that. Assessment-wise, it has it way down at maybe $360,000, $380,000, and actually, with the amount of work it needs, it honestly should be down at $320,000. And they're being outbid when it's being up at $420,000. They're being outbid by $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, as much as $80,000. I've heard, depending on what the property is. That's not sustainable. And that's the kind of thing that leads to the conditions of, the French Revolution. If people feel like they cannot get ahead, if people feel like they can't get anywhere, they're going to start getting, they're going to start having a serious problem. We have a little message here. We've had a couple of comments. I'm going to go to them now. We have from Ilya Hart. Here in Nelson, selling at $100,000 over asking. Yeah, that's nuts. By the way, that's a very pretty picture, by the way, Ilya. I might be wrong, but I feel like if you're telling me that you're near Nelson and stuff, it almost sounds like you're near that one lake that's near, what's that place called? Liard. That's what I thought it was. Or is that Fort Nelson that's up there? That's Fort Nelson, isn't it? That's my bad. Point being, that's still a very nice picture. But no, $100,000 over asking. No, that's not a joke. Things have gone insane. And for what? Like, here's a better question. How are you going to get, so you got this BC bungalow, okay, like, and we all know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, it's a split level, right? I wish, is there like a drawing app on this thing? Like, now that I'm producing my own show, I almost wish there was like a drawing app. I don't even think I have MS Paint on this computer. Does MS Paint even exist? Hey, it does. That's bizarre. I don't know if I want to get into this because that's going to be a whole thing, but yeah, we're not going to do that today. That's getting a little bit out of there. We'll try that another time. But I mean, a BC bungalow, right? So a BC bungalow is what, right? I can't remember how wide, right? So a house is 40 feet wide at one end, and it's another 60, 80 feet long, whatever. They're 2,400 square feet, so it's 60 by 40, right? They're 2,400 square feet, and they're 2 stories, right? And they're split levels, right? So your basement's 3/4 sunk, right? You got windows in your basement that you can see over. I mean, this is a green screen, so you can't really see anything. You can see the light that's behind me, though. But you've got, I'm in a basement right now, and I mean, it's 3/4 sunk. I'm only 5'8", and I can see out the window, right? So you've got a split level, right? So you come into the entranceway, there's a set of stairs going down, a set of stairs going up, which will take you essentially the 6 feet down and the 6 feet up, or ish, 5 feet down, 5 feet up, that the house is split on, in order to make sure you didn't have to dig another 5 feet into the earth, because we all know that's the most expensive part of construction. So, and that much more concrete is more expensive. So you got that house. It's 40 on one end and 60 the other way, right? Ish, whatever. It's 2,400 square feet between 2 levels, right? And you sit there and you look at that and you're like, okay, that house on a half-acre lot or whatever in a small town in Canada, right? A town of 100,000. What is that house worth? Well, I think that most people would think that if it's in a really bad shape, it'd be somewhere in the 280 range. And if it's in really good shape, it's in the 350, 368 range, right? That's what you'd think, right? And maybe you'd change those numbers a little bit. Maybe even in really bad shape in a hot market, it's 300,000. And in really good shape in a hot market, it's 390. Maybe even 4 if it's in really, really, really good shape. And been perfectly renovated, and somebody else put in all the sweat labor, and it's just immaculate. If at best, and that's still steep, I'd still say you're still in a more like a 280 to 380 range for kind of your level of housing. There are people getting 450 for that, and it still needs work, and it's not perfectly renovated. There's people getting 380 for houses that need to be renovated, 350 that houses that need to be seriously renovated. What are you doing? And how would you ever get that out of it? How are you going to get $500,000 out of a house that wasn't worth $420 that you paid for it 5 years ago, if we go 5 years in the future? That's my question. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. And you won't get your money out of it. It's not possible. It's not physically possible to do it unless you're literally just going to continue printing money and inflating prices. Like, and just keep the money machine printing. It's not possible. So that's what blows my mind. It's like, we all know it's a lie. It's like this old Soviet Union, right? It's like it's an empire of lies. It's not possible that a house that was built that long ago and has problems, has things that need to be changed about it, and who knows where it is in its life cycle, and how much maintenance is going to be, and that wet labor in. Like, what's a reasonable price for that? $350 is a perfectly reasonable price. Even if it's somebody's nest egg, it's a perfectly reasonable price for a house that's functional. It'll need work, but it's functional and it's decently built. The roof was done 10 years ago. That's a decent price. You downgrade into something else. You retire into a small condo apartment sort of thing. You don't have to do maintenance anymore. You don't have to do. This is the life cycle of housing. For that same thing I'm describing, people are expecting north of 380 into 4, sometimes 420, and getting outbid. Still getting outbid. I don't know what to tell you. There's no way that house is worth that, but there we are. So we got a few more comments here. The housing market in Hinton AB is down right now. However, in an IT house, The basement completely unfinished. A lot of original windows and doors. $290 ask price. It's one of the cheapest houses in town right now. Crazy. So again, another evidence of things getting out of hand. We got Susan Roos for you. We're going to cancel Canada Day. City workers, including the mayor, damn well better be work that day at regular pay. That's actually a brilliant point. I'd never really thought about that. That's funny. There's some dorsal fins in there. That's a funny point, Susan Murphy Henderson. I hadn't really thought about that, but it's true. It's true. If you're going to cancel Canada Day, why do you still get stat pay for Canada Day? I actually used to make this point when it came to atheists and Christmas. Atheists who kept saying, keep the Christ out of Christmas, or say happy holidays instead. I always said, well, I expect you to be there on the 25th and 26th of December working at regular pay at your job all day. Enjoy yourself. And I think there's a place for that. It's like, if you're going to complain about this Christian holiday that gives you 2 days off, go right ahead. I expect to see you at work tomorrow at your regular pay. Thank you for covering for everybody who actually isn't a complete nincompoop. No, I appreciate that. Thank you for those comments. We've had a couple of good comments today, actually. We've had one over here with Elaine McNeil. I respect Mr. Ellis, but he also jumped to conclusions about Kamloops. I think we've all jumped to questions about Kamloops, because the issue at hand is that, of course, we don't know everything about what happened in Kamloops, and so we need to be careful about that. We've all jumped to conclusion. The outrage that's taken place when it comes to Kamloops has become a problem, and so we need to be honest about the fact that, again, it's kind of confusing. There's no way to know for sure what happened. But we need to investigate, and if you I don't care where you find 215 remains of anybody, regardless of race, class, or creed, or religion, or background, you need to figure out what happened there. If this happened near an ancient site somewhere, we would just call it, an archaeology dig. And so off would go the little archaeology interns, and they would take out their little brushes and start brushing away and using their little trowels and starting to dig up everything. And that would be all it is. And there'd be no controversy around it. There ought to be controversy, because we have a clue as to what was going on at the time. And we know that the residential schools have a very complicated legacy. That needs to be told. That needs to be told. A few other comments we've had here. Rose West had a couple of points throughout our show today. There are hundreds of thousands of mixed race Métis who are both light and dark skinned in the same family. Political racism only divides us, and that's true. It's absolutely true. We don't need a politics of divisiveness. That's not going to help us with anything. Actually, my producer sent me a message here. He's just reminded me that we actually haven't done the Resistance Coffee promo. So I got to go find brand white overlay. There we go. Resistance Coffee. All right. I'm sorry to be tagging this on to the end of the show. I don't know if Resistance Coffee's tuning in right now, but I apologize that it was a little bit later than I had hoped, but that's okay. We're getting to it now, and I still fully support Resistance Coffee. So Resistance Coffee Company is, of course, based in Weyburn, and Saskatchewan, to be clear, and you can order their coffee online. And when you support Resistance Coffee, you're supporting any and all freedom movements in Canada that increase our freedoms, not curtail them. And so Resistance Coffee Company has a strong affinity for freedom, for liberty, for ordered liberty, peace, order, and good government. They do not want the world to be taken over by the woke left, and they don't want political correctness dictating the way that corporations act or anybody acts. It's wrong. And that we all know that anybody who's kind of waving a certain colored flag or making certain kneeling gestures to a certain race, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. The point is that they're still trying to get anybody on the take, and they're trying to take money from people. So Resistance is just not doing that and just saying, hey, if you give us money, we're also, for our business, for our product, we're also using it to increase the freedoms of Canadians, because we're tired of these people who keep trying to take away the freedoms of Canadians. So I really respect that. So that's Resistance Coffee Company, and you can find them online at resistancecoffeecompany.com. Don't forget to use the promo code Western Standard for 10% off your first order. We have that little banner ticking along the bottom there. I'm going to leave the banner up. I'm going to take down the panel. And as we kind of round out the hour here and come back to the comments a little bit, maybe something that needs to be kind of touched on is that I suppose in no uncertain terms, again, maybe my outlook is kind of bleak. Maybe it's something that especially people who are right of center, because I mean that's definitely what this show is marketed towards and what the Western Standard is marketed towards. But people who are right of center are not quite used to as a take. And I know that I've said this before on the show. We have a lot of people on here, and the most consistent people we have on here are, of course, left wing, Stuart Parker and Aaron Eckman. And we're working on that. I mean, to be completely candid with you, the show needs work. We all know that. We're into week 10, week 12 now, 11, 12, somewhere around there. And we've got some renovating to do, some updating to do. We need to put a shot in the arm of this show. Not to that sounded like a COVID reference. We're not talking about that. But the flip side of the equation is that one of the reasons why we've explored some of the topics we do on this show is that it's really important for us to look at the real issues. And I would argue that, again, with the sovereignty thing, maybe the reason I'm ambivalent about sovereignty is that it's that old line, right? Didn't like your old masters, how do you like your new ones? We have problems in this country that are not going to change just because you change the flag that's on the pole. So you might not like that the flag poles are all at half-mast right now because of what happened in Kamloops, and that you feel kind of disrespected, or that the legacy of this country, the cultural heritage of this country is being disrespected. I can hear you on all those things. I just don't want to even be in this country anymore because this stupid country is so stupid. It's people just destroying it. Like, let's just make a better country tomorrow. It's like, well, what are we going to do tomorrow? Are the housing prices in Prince George going to come down tomorrow because we separate from Canada? That'd be great. If that happens, that's awesome. I'll do that. That'd be awesome. Sure, I'll vote for separation. But at what cost? What advantage? What is going to change? I feel like a lot of the issues we have today politically are all tied up with, we can get into religious and spiritual issues another time. I'm a deeply religious man, and those are topics that appeal to me. But deeper than that, I think that we have to be honest about the fact that there are issues of our society that are leading us to look for all sorts of solutions in places maybe they don't exist. We all want to figure out homelessness better in this country. We all want better medical care. We all want more efficient medical care. We all want people to not feel left behind. We want real economic opportunity. We want less red tape and less people pulling us over on the side of the road for nonsensical reasons, while down the street there's a drug dealer who we all know is a drug dealer with an underage girlfriend who the cops keep not busting. That gets a little annoying. I don't care that I'm going 10 over the speed limit. I want you to go bust down the door of the drug dealer down the street from me. That's who I want you to deal with. I don't care what I'm doing wrong. I care what he's doing wrong. And on it goes. It doesn't really matter what it is in this country. There's a lot of things that have gone wrong. And those social issues, we want them solved. We want to meet them. This country lacks confidence. This country can't put together a decent procurement for its own army. We can't build jets. We can't build ships. We are a nation of can't do, which is really weird because the only way that we became a nation is a can do attitude. You can subsist in America on corn. That's what some of my forebears did. I'm part of the Sioux Nation. They chase buffalo, but I mean, not so far away from us were people eating corn for a living, and you can. In America, you can live for free. You can live fine. You can live in Florida. You can live in the southwestern United States. You're not going to freeze to death. In Canada, you will freeze to death. And the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that the can-do attitude of our founding, speaking of Canada Day and wrapping all of this episode up back into this question of canceling Canada Day and everything else, like maybe we should cancel Canada Day in the sense that the Canada that we live in right now is a canceled Canada. It doesn't exist. When you can't build a pipeline because of basically political terrorism being funded by either Americans or the Chinese, when you can't build a pipeline, when you can't build basic infrastructure, when you can't solve very rudimentary problems around what to do with your health care and with your education, etc., when you can't do that, I don't know what leg you have to stand on anymore. You're not really a country anymore. You're lost. And that's exactly it. Maybe the reason Canada Day is getting canceled is we don't even know what Canada Day means. There's just a general ignorance in this country of what this country even stands for. There are beautiful things this country did. There are honorable things this country did. This country took Vimy Ridge. This country took, the beach in Normandy. This country helped defeat tyranny. This country was on the right side of apartheid in South Africa. It's on the right side of some of those racial questions in the United States when they were having their problems in the 60s, trying to figure out where they were going to go as a nation. This country has been on the right side of a lot of things, but somehow, somewhere along the way, it has lost a sense of itself, and it can't build anything. And so the irony is, maybe coming all the way back around, I'm not saying that they're right to cancel Canada Day, but in a sense, what is there to celebrate on Canada Day if this country can't even have confidence in itself? Either you make your myth, you make your story, or somebody will write it for you. Either you figure out what you want to do, or somebody will employ you to make their dream come true, right? And that's probably where I'm going to end the program today. This country, again, I'm ambivalent about sovereignty. I remain, at least at this point, a situational federalist. But the point is that nonetheless, regardless of where you stand on how good or bad Canada is, if you don't have a sense of self, you will fail as a nation. We are failing ourselves as a nation. We're failing our future generations as a nation. Whether it's going to be just your local town that's a little country or the whole of Canada, we're failing ourselves because we don't have a sense of self. And we are in deep trouble if we think that's how we can go on. We're going to be on again tomorrow, bright and early, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. Do tune in, and thank you so much for watching. I'm going to put up some banners now and see if I can get this done properly. And exit this